great that you're recording this laugh track, which I've been told is useful to play at entrances to hotels to scare away evil spirits and tame unruly children.
Hello and welcome to China Talk, hosted on the Lawfare Network. In this week's edition of Coronastories, we'll hear from Yang in Beijing, Asmud in Nepal, and Lambert in Singapore. We'll close with some James Brown because that really cheered me up.
I'm a particle physicist by training and trade, but I also write a lot on science and China and Chinese policy and society. So I was born and raised in China, and I spent the first 19 years of my life there. And I was raised by a single mother, and we have a complicated relationship. So we don't, for the past 10 and a half years, I've lived in the United States mostly. My mother and I, we don't really have long conversations, especially not in the more recent years. But we do exchange like messages or emails at least once a day. And when the coronavirus outbreak became known in China in late January, and basically days before the Wuhan and most of Hubei province was put under lockdown, there was a lot of an outpouring of outrage on Chinese social media, criticizing the government's initial cover-up of this. A lot of it was reminiscent of the SARS outbreak in 2003. And there was a lot of demand for transparency, for accountability, and for free speech on Chinese social media. I had a sense that what I was seeing, however hopeful it felt in that moment, was very much just in the moment. But I also had this wish, or you might call it fantasy, that and I thought this might change my mother's mind just a little bit. Because growing up, my mother always taught me that on one hand, politics is taboo. On the other hand, I do feel that my mother believes in what she is taught and what she teaches. My mother is a retired elementary school teacher. And so in late January, when my mother started messaging me about the situation, about the outbreak and the government response with regards to the coronavirus epidemic in China, a lot of it was preconditioned on her worries for me, even though at that point there were barely any cases outside of China, let alone in the United States. She was still, as a mother, more concerned about me than herself, even though there were a fair amount of cases in her city. And so she was basically keeping me in the loop about how the outbreak was progressing. And then she was sending me these, forwarding me these reports from Chinese state media about the actions the Chinese government is doing. And I think there is a context to this, is my mother very much sees a lot of this as some sort of a metaphor or an allegory. That she does feel that she is mother tongue, motherland. The government, the Chinese government in its propaganda does use this kind of maternal or even matronizing language that depicts the government as this benign, not just benign, but genuinely loving and self-sacrificing mothering figure. And the people, the citizens, are its children who should be submissive and obedient or filial in some way. And so I think my mother was sending me these reports and messages from Chinese state media that always comes with comments and annotations of hers because she is a teacher. And I always feel there is this subtlety that how much my mother was projecting our relationship onto this Chinese government's response to the coronavirus outbreak. And so she was praising the government for its swift action, and she was praising the sense of discipline and strength and resolve the government has shown. And I was always pushing back in the sense that it was inhumane, it was inconsiderate. There were less fortunate members of society, the migrant workers, the homeless, the poor, who have a tenuous relationship with the state, that were most affected and who would not appear in any of these state media reports, and their well-being are basically not being considered with these drastic policies. And I think my mother is kind of projecting that my own criticism of the Chinese government was my own delayed projection of her treatment of me or the way she raised me when I was a child with a very strict and in many ways brutal home environment. And so it's a fascinating thing. And as an academic myself, I find it intellectually fascinating as well how this conversation has gone on. I was always pushing back. On one hand, it's because I believe in intellectual integrity, that I need to be honest. On the other hand, I also know my mother lives in China. I can't be as free in talking with her as I do when I write for English language publications that are based in the US or elsewhere. But these things I cannot, when the subject is the Chinese government, I cannot say them so explicitly with my mother. And so it becomes this really interesting conversation I've had with my mother for basically 2.5 months now, where the subject matter is the coronavirus outbreak. But the conversation is loaded. It carries this different attitudes towards the government, our different interpretations of state power, as well as these subtle ways of how we are bringing other aspects of our relationship and our understandings of the world into it, while also trying to bypass censorship. I think, my mother, on one hand, she is explicitly very patriotic and supportive of the Chinese government. On the other hand, she is also a devout Christian. And I think on a philosophical level, one can easily make the remark of how like communism and Christianity are not compatible. But it's actually not like that. I actually think they are in some way quite compatible, and not on the philosophical level, but on a level when it comes to an individual submitting to a higher power and trying to seek its protection. And I feel that's very much what my mother has been doing for a better part of 20 years now, when she's on one hand patriotic, on the other hand a Christian, and becoming increasingly devout with the years. And so I think with regards to this pandemic, on one hand, she is singing praises and supportive of the Chinese government's actions. On the other hand, she also understands that the virus is a creation of nature, and it's something that she feels only God could eradicate. And so she is, on one hand, sending me articles from Chinese state media about what the Chinese government is doing. On the other hand, she also sends me prayer verses from her or members in her church group, because since large gatherings are suspended in China, her church has moved these mass and these services online, and parishioners use WeChat to share these prayers they wrote. And so it's an interesting thing to see how my mother navigates this, and in a way it shows that there is a sense, there is a limitation to both of her beliefs on its own, that she doesn't think God by itself would be able to rid the world of this virus. She still believes in government action. On the other hand, she also doesn't think or doesn't feel government action alone is enough, at least not on an emotional, on a psychological level. So she's also praying to God and asking for some kind of, not necessarily miracle, but at least like divine intervention or divine guidance. I can give you a bit of an example, which some of it I've also written about, with the conversation I had with my mother on the first day of Lunar New Year, which was also the third day after Wuhan and most of Hubei province was put under lockdown. And I think it's also interesting in this context, because I called my mother to wish her happy Lunar New Year, as one should, and she also kind of like demanded, even though it's always difficult for me to talk to her And also in that particular context, because Hubei and Wuhan hold a specific place in our hearts, because that's where my father and her father, my maternal grandfather, was born and raised and lived until their early 20s before their education brought them outside of the province. Both my father and my mother's father left Hubei for graduate school. And in particular, my grandfather, he was not from Wuhan specifically, but he went to undergraduate at Wuhan University. And neither of the other two men in our lives are alive. And so I think it was something emotional. And on Chinese New Year, it was also something we're trying to circle around. And I think when our conversation was so focused on the political aspects of the lockdown was some kind of psychological self-defense mechanism that we are trying to somehow intellectualize it so that it becomes less emotionally charged, since it hinges on tragedy and on loss. And we were trying to suppress that on an occasion that should be joyous, since it was the new year. And so my mother and I, we talked about the lockdown itself. And I myself, I was very much shaken by this drastic decision that the Chinese government put forward. And I think that the decision was announced somewhere like midnight or like wee hours in the morning. And it was supposed to go into effect in the early morning, like 8 or 9 a.m., I believe. And so it basically didn't give people time to prepare. And there were people who were trying to rush out of Wuhan, and also the migrant workers and this and that were not taken care of. And so these were all on my mind when I was speaking to my mother and talking about the lockdown. And I had very, very naively assumed that those would be the first things on my mother's mind, that at least on this issue, she and I should be on the same page, that it was a humanitarian disaster. And she doesn't have to be critical of the Chinese government to recognize the human cost of it. And so I was actually taken aback when my mother was very firm in her support of this drastic action. And so I was saying this is a humanitarian disaster, and my mother was like, she doesn't understand. I was like, how is that not obvious to you that when the public transport system are being shut down and people are not allowed to leave, like how would they be able to get food or get regular medical care, which doesn't have anything to do with the coronavirus, or like people who are elderly, who are disabled, who couldn't leave their houses and couldn't get the things they need. And my mother was genuinely surprised on the other end of the line. And she was just like, I don't understand you. Are you talking about how the people of Wuhan would be able to get food, or 怎么吃,怎么喝,怎么办? They do it as they would always do. Life goes on as usual. And that actually angered me. And I was like, you don't live there and you don't know this. And at that point, there was already reports coming out from inside Wuhan of people who were posting on Weibo and other types of Chinese social media, since there was that period when the censorship was relatively lax, when people were just talking about the situation they suddenly found themselves in. Even when we understand the people who could post on Weibo and use social media, by and large are middle class, who are better educated, are more privileged, and the truly vulnerable would not even be able to have that kind of access to such media. And so I think my mother was also surprised, and I think there wasn't necessarily completely unaware, but she was kind of trying to compartmentalize and not think about it, and she just believed that, this virus needs to be contained and the government is taking this action, and people would naturally support it because this was the only option. And she believes that the Chinese government would have taken care of the people, whether they're in or out of Wuhan. And so I was also pushing her on that point about the initial censorship especially when there was the provincial the provincial People's Congress and Party Congress that was in session in mid-January in Hubei, in Wuhan, in the capital of the province. And I was saying that how the case number didn't increase over that stretch of time, and that is such an obvious anomaly with any epidemic. And I was telling my mother, you don't have to say anything, but that just so that like you must also see this and know it's not natural and not right. And my mother was saying, oh, no, it's not like that because the virus has a 2-week incubation period. And that was exactly like the amount of time where you didn't see the increase in case count. Of course, we knew then that the virus was already spreading in December. And now I think there are newer reports about how this was probably already there in November. And so that 2-week incubation period was it was unscientific and it was actually odd. But my mother said it in a way that wasn't, she was trying to twist herself to believe it. It was something that she just accepted it and found it just like to be absolutely true, and she didn't need to question it. And so I found that to be interesting as well. And I think I did push her in that conversation where we talked for over an hour, and I think a part of me, I'm still trying to digest that conversation, whether I pushed too hard and that made her sad when she was still helpless. Like if she had compartmentalized and looked away from the plight inside Wuhan as a way to feel not completely powerless, also as a way to preserve her own mental well-being. Why was I trying to expose that to her and try to almost put a moral judgment on that if she wasn't identifying with the humanitarian disaster, there was something almost selfish or less aware of her. In that conversation, she talked about on how her father, when he was an undergraduate student at Wuhan University in the 1950s, and then he participated in the civilian efforts to help with the flood relief when Yangtze flooded to historic levels that summer. And so I think that was one moment when we were trying to dance around the people we were closest to and who were from the province and whom we have lost. But the conversation inevitably went back to it. She and I are very different people, and that was very apparent from a very young age. When I was very young, that we have a fundamentally different worldview with regards to our attitudes towards authority, and it was for that reason and a lot of other reasons that I knew that I couldn't stay in China, that I had to leave, and so it wasn't that being in the US has changed me. It has allowed me to grow into the person I've wanted to be. But I think it comes as no surprise to my mother or myself that we are very different people.
Hi, namaste. I'm Osmod and I'm based in Kathmandu, Nepal. So the first coronavirus case appeared around like 2.5 months ago, around like roughly 75 days ago. So we had one confirmed case. So since then, we haven't done that much testing in Nepal. So it's a country of 30 million people. So to give you an idea, it's the size of Beijing or almost the size of New York in terms of population. So with that number of people, we have just carried around 2,200 tests in the last 2.5 months. So the country is in lockdown, since last couple of weeks. All the businesses are shut. Nepal is one of the main source of revenues is tourism. That's gone down here like everywhere else in the world. For a lot of Nepali, I think it's starting to cause a lot of pains. Oh, this is April 7th, 2020. What has happened in Nepal is there were cases in the past where the government, especially the police, to use force on people. There were videos emerging of people, the police beating up people, if they're walking on the streets. So that was not very well taken in the media. And also, I don't think that should be happening. Rather than safeguarding people, the government was using force. But now I think largely people have, largely due to awareness also, and also, what do you call it, repeated government, maybe that's the word, they have largely stayed home. So in Nepal, what happens is a lot of times, so people get grocery on a day-to-day basis. There are a lot of local stores. So usually, there's a grocery store in every corner of the streets. There are multiple in one streets. So usually, people we just go and buy on a day-to-day basis. For people who are largely like middle class, this problem, like I think like anywhere else in the world, hasn't hit hard. But for a lot of people, and when I talk about Nepal, that's close to like 90% of people in the informal sector who depend on daily wages. For them, I think doing basic grocery, like not having ways to earn, that has really hit them hard. So what we have seen in the past few days is a lot of people who are based in the city, these daily migrant workers, wage workers, are even taking extreme measures of like walking 200 kilometers back home, and sometimes it takes them like 10 days. We've seen videos of people walking on the highways with their kids. So because like if they stay in the city, they can't feed their family and themselves, they don't have enough money or cash. So I think the vulnerability of the people is largely, the ability to absorb shock is also based on class, and we see the inequality even getting worse in these circumstances. So Nepal is really interesting. We have a very volatile political environment. The governance system is pretty fragile. So like so one is testing. It's been almost more than 70 days, and we have had 2,200 tests. It might be one of the lowest in the world. So that is pretty bleak. In terms of healthcare, like we have just like few doctors per like 1,000 people, or even like maybe 100,000 people. So what that translates is like our health system is really not prepared. So it's heard of cases of people like hundreds of people, thousands of people in quarantine. But see, if we really to spike the number of tests, and if we to see a spike in confirmed cases, I don't know like how Nepali or third world like health system would cope up. The third thing is with like governance. So in a place with governance, and this might be very different from China or like South Korea or Singapore, where you have seen like really like government step up and take really quick actions. In Nepal, what has happened is say there was an instance of procurement of PPE, personal protective equipment. So Nepal doesn't produce any of them. So we asked, like, bought a few from China, and also the Chinese government provided some. But there was an issue of a massive corruption scandal in that, a few $100,000 were skimmed off, like, the of the money, that was supposed to go to purchase the PPE. So the government, what actually it did was, it asked the Nepalese army to step in and procure the goods, because the army is an institutionalized institution in Nepal, and like there are systems in place. But that also leads to pitfalls of democracy, right? If there's a elected government in place, and if it's not able to even just like procure basic medical supplies in the times of need, and if it has to resort to army, what does that say about a governance system in a country? So people have been asking questions, and I think this is one of the bright light I see is maybe these are good times for us to reflect on where we stand and what do we need to do moving forward as a society. So we have heard news about 10 million job losses in the US. That's many times higher than what the last recession did. In a country like Nepal, we don't have the figures, but this is a country with a median age of less than 25. So what would happen in a country, right, say, where a lot of people are young and they're left without job, left without proper support system in the society, that's a recipe for social unrest, not just in Nepal, but in a lot of part of the world. And even thinking from the perspective of rulers, governments is not a good thing, even thinking selfishly. So I think for policymakers, this is a very good lesson, not just in terms of health policy, but also social safety needs. So one of the examples a lot of people could relate might be like, say, in US, we have heard of news of people who might not even have $400, a lot of people. just as basic saving to take care of the healthcare expenses. In Nepal, the situation is pretty similar. Like, you can't compare dollars to dollars, but a lot of people are in left in similar boat. So, like anywhere else in the world, a lot of people, it turns out, the wealth is unequally distributed. How does government and how does society start thinking about that? Because what Corona is doing is, say, if you are rich and wealthy, you can take precautions, right? You can stockpile on food, you can get access to the best health coverage, and you can work from home, like, take a white collar job. But it seems for a lot of world that's not an issue. Like, that's simply not doable. So I guess these are the large, like, broad reflections. I don't have answers yet, but it seems if things go like this, these are recipes for not just, like, social unrest, but major upheavals in the way we live our lives. So, and Nepal has a very close relations with China. So I guess the Nepali media so far haven't had that coverage. But what has happened is, so the PPE we procure from China weren't according to World Health Organization standard. Not because it was, like, the vendor's fault, but because we had corruption issues within the country. The government was supposed to, like, check the orders and make sure they were up to WHO standards. We didn't do that, and there was massive corruption. So that was fault in our side. So I think the China equation, where it comes into play, is, so for a country like Nepal, our resources are really stretched. One example is, like, that many people could tangibly relate is the government set up a fund to, like, deal with the coronavirus. So in US, like, we had more than $2 million stimulus. In China, it was close to 400 billion. US, like, so massive amount of money. We don't have that money. So the amount collected until today was close to $0.2 billion, right? So it's like it's nothing. So that's the situation country is. And what we received was the Chinese government sent out free medical supplies. The Jack Ma Foundation sent masks and stuff. So lots of good help from China. So, but what has, like, what the narrative that has been repeating in the media is, I see, not in terms of particular China, but a lot of fake news. Just today, for a lot of people, like, like my parents, for instance, they use Facebook a lot, and Facebook is the source of news for a lot of elderly people in Nepal. So my mom showed me a news where Harvard professor was apparently arrested, and there was a fake news circulating that, oh, like, he was arrested because he helped spread coronavirus, right? That's a fake news. I was like, when I first read that, I was like, mom, like, how did you learn about this? It's fake. I did some googling, and, like, I had to spend some time on the internet and did some fact checking, and turns out, like, yes, he was, like, he had some issues with the law enforcement, but it wasn't something else related to research. But he was based in Wuhan, right? So I see a lot of fake news in the media. Sometimes people talk about this Ayurvedic cures of, like, having turmeric, and that will cast off a disease, or something like taking vapor, like, in hot water. So I think a lot of fake news circulating in the media, and sometimes people just, like, don't know where to fact check, right? If you are trained in research and if you have some critical angle, you could obviously do that. But from what I see, a lot of people, especially in Nepal, I can't speak in other parts of the world, we take media for granted. Whatever you see in some online news portal, we take it for granted. And that has, I think, contributed to more fear mongering and just misperception of what the virus does, and the scale of this severity we are facing now. So the Nepali fake news is really, like, the media landscape is really interesting. There's a lot of, like, online portals. Sometimes, like, there's a guy or, like, few people running the media portals, and it appears very legit. So they have this online portal, and they publish turn out news very periodical. Like, sometimes, a lot of times, it might be based on fact, but it seems the media wants attention. It's like it's a clickbait, right? So the more, like, clicks you have, so you don't care to verify, because you're so stressed on your resources that you just want to turn out the news and get people to your site. So by the time it gets verified, it already has had, like, sometimes I've seen, in case of Nepal, hundreds and thousands of shares in Facebook. So a lot of that happening. So I don't know, so at least like if the content were in media, we could maybe, I'm sure there are censors in place, in social media. But if it's in a language like Nepali, which all very few people use, like how do you handle the fake news situation, right? Which I think is not helping the situation at the moment. Yeah. What do the Maoists think of the coronavirus? So the for the listeners, it might be helpful to know the system of governance we are in. So Nepal is a democratic country. We have elections. We try to have regular elections. That doesn't always happen due to political instability. So in the last elections, we had the communists came to power through parliamentary or electoral systems, and they have close to two-thirds. So you have a communist party in power, which has been elected democratically, and there's a party which is more towards right called Nepali Congress. So there are 7 provinces in Nepal, and out of 7, if I'm not mistaken, in six of the provinces, there's the Communist Party, almost with absolute majority in all the provinces. So what that means is the Communist Party is called Nepal Communist Party, is very strong in Nepal. But at the same time, the party is strong, but the state isn't. The state mechanisms aren't. And Nepal is a democratic country. So unlike China, for instance, or with a party state, and the party has a lot of say in media and policies, the Nepali State Communist Party doesn't have that much say in how the media is regulated. They have tried to come up with regulations recently, but the culture of freedom is so ingrained, I think, in Nepali politics and Nepali culture in general, that it's hard to curb the media. So the media is very free, one of the freest media, always not always good, that I've seen in the world, with fake news circulating. So how the government has reacted, the Maoist. So the government is not a Maoist government, it's a communist government, obviously with a party, with a faction, that came up after struggle. So Nepal had a decade-long Maoist war for 10 years, and the Maoists came to mainstream politics, and they merged their party with another communist party to form this large political party. So they are in power. So I think so. Whether they are right or left in Nepali spectrum, everyone is concerned about. I think just today there was this address from the Prime Minister. Everyone is concerned. They are trying to take the best measures. So we haven't seen, while we have seen very active state involvement in trying to curb the situation, there hasn't been very strong, I think, curbing measures from the Communist Party, because whenever that tends to happen, there are so many checks and balances in Nepali cultural system, more than political system, that tends to keep the government in reins. So one of the ways in which Nepali politicians are curbed is, one of the very good examples is this procurement of testing kits in coronavirus. So obviously the party is a communist in the government, so they try to procure the kits. Usually when you try to procure public goods, there's a system of calling out for tenders. So usually you call out for expression of interest, multiple companies bid, and some companies get the tender based on their competitive bidding. Because of the severity and the time of the disease, like you know the government said that, okay, we don't have enough time, we want to fast track the procurement process, and they decide to give it to a company. Apparently it seems by taking some bribes. So it's not proven, but that's the rumor, to company. And somehow the news in the media got it leaked. People started talking about it, and within a couple of days the government decided, okay, we're not going forward with this procurement, we're going to stop. Because and that didn't happen because of checks and balances within the government, because the government is extremely in terms of numbers powerful. But the opposition party, a lot of civil society members through media, and also a lot of social media pressures from people came into play, and they criticized the government, and the government took a step back. So this, I think, while the systems, while the government is there, they have the Communist Party have absolute majority. It doesn't always translate to absolute power because of these checks and balances in the culture.
I'm Lambert. I live in Singapore. I would say Singapore's response was pretty good from the beginning. They try to quarantine the people and did contact tracing pretty dutifully. So they were able to contain the virus for a relatively long time. So if you count the starting time of patients, sort of travelers visiting Singapore who showed symptoms and tested positive, that was early to mid-January, and now it is early April. So it's been 3 months, and now the situation is still under control. It's getting, it's probably approaching the edge of a bigger outbreak. The life in Singapore before the circuit breaker was implemented was pretty normal. Lots of companies started working from home, mine included. I think only around 10% of Singaporeans wear masks on subway or in the mall. The circuit breaker operates quite differently from China's lockdown because lots of services are still here. So all the food related services were still open. Even if you cannot dine in, you can only take away food. And all the medical services, of course, are open. I think transportation are open. Manufacturing that are considered could impacting global supply chain are also open. So I think they try to implement a lockdown while keeping the essential services with the consideration that the economic impact could be minimized. I think, okay, how should I, how should I, sorry, I'm not sure how I can incorporate this question. Okay. The public opinion I see online is pretty positive. Singapore citizens are, well known for being obedient to what government says. For local Singaporeans, they don't cook at home a lot. So I do not think the locals will start cooking a lot more often just because the coronavirus has hit, and because all the hawker centers will remain open and all the supermarkets remain open, so they still have lots of food options. Regarding racism, I think it's probably one of the advantages of being an Asian country because Chinese ethnically is the majority of Singapore populations. So it's hard to tell on the street if you are a Singaporean Chinese or a China Chinese. So it's very hard to practice racism, basically. I think the foreign workers, especially the ones that are on the lower income side, they're not very well taken care of financially because foreign workers, especially those who work like very low wage jobs, they're going to be the worst hit in this whole pandemic because their jobs are mostly services that involve dealing with people. So when the businesses shut down, they will not get their money, but they still have to pay rents. The government is not providing enough financial help, largely, I think, because there has long been a local hostility against, government treating foreigners too well. Probably 3 weeks, 4 weeks ago, Malaysia announced that they were locking down the whole country, and there were lots of migrant workers from Malaysia who took, the gap between the announcement and the official closure to rush to Singapore, and they were trying to find accommodations because these Malaysian migrant workers, they commute between Singapore and Malaysia every day, and now they have to find accommodation. The government initially tried to provide a 14-day accommodation subsidy for employers who want to keep the Malaysian migrant workers working. But I think they did face some backlash, so they announced they would not extend this 14-day accommodation subsidy further, even if the Malaysian lockdown has actually been extended for 2 more weeks. So I think that's the case where the government was trying to push the limit. They want to extend the financial support to the migrant workers a bit, but they were not courageous enough to push further. The other thing I think is very interesting to watch is how the Singapore's foreign policy is going to shift, given that the level of hostility between China and the West in general has increased and will increase significantly in the future. So Singapore has traditionally been on the no alliance front. So they try to be friends with every country, but that line is going to be much harder to walk in the future. And so I think it will be extremely interesting to watch how the new PAP government is going to walk that line. Or are they still trying to be? Are they still going to push this strategy of being friends with everyone, or are they going to realize that this is a path that's not worth pursuing?
Hi, I would like to give a short update on what has happened in Singapore more recently since the last time I spoke with Jordan. As you can see, the numbers are increasing very sharply. We're now over 11,000, and we're basically at a pace of adding 1,000 every day. If you take a more detailed look at the numbers, you'll find that most of these numbers are from foreign worker dormitories, and they compose of close to 9,000 out of these 11,000 detected positive. And I believe most of these foreign workers have caught the virus way before the circuit breaker started, which means the virus has been spreading in the dormitory community for quite a while now. It's only because recently massive testing were being conducted in the dormitories that these numbers start getting reflected in the total numbers. Aside from the foreign worker dormitories, the community spread in a more wide community is actually decreasing, which means the circuit breaker is working and the further risk of community spread is under control. Both the linked and unlinked cases have been decreasing, so it doesn't pose a genuine enhanced health risk to local Singaporeans and people who don't live in the foreign worker dormitories. I also want to do a bit of deep dive into the outbreak of dorms. I think there are two reasons. The first reason is there was this strange policy of asking people who were tested for COVID-19 to stay at home while waiting for the results. This is a reasonable policy for locals because they do have some home facilities to isolate themselves and not socialize with their family members when they're waiting for results. But it definitely didn't make sense for foreign workers because they live in rooms that compose of 8 to 10 bunk beds per room. So there's no way they can isolate themselves when they're waiting for results. The second is, of course, the government inaction on the dormitory conditions. The first foreign worker who tested positive was back in end of January, so it was very early. But at that time, governments were only handing out brochures to the dorms and telling employers to enhance their hygiene conditions. There was nothing mandatory, and those measures were definitely not comparable to what they were doing right now, which is they were moving the foreign workers outside of the dorms gradually, so to reduce the crowdedness in dorms. They were also telling the existing workers not to go out of their doors, and they were conducting massive testing and isolating people who tested positive. So I think the underlying sentiment behind this inaction on foreign worker dormitories is probably because foreign policymakers and locals alike, they think of foreign workers as invisible because they are transient. The foreign worker policy is designed to not make foreign workers stay. They're supposed to come here, work, and then they will leave, with their newly attained money. I also don't think it's very fair to blame it completely on the government. Of course, the government would take most of the blame, and I have no problems with that. But I think it's also noticeable that the media, as well as the opposition, or people in general, failed to raise flags the potential risky conditions in foreign worker dormitories. Again, because of this, invisible people mindset. Going forward, I think in the dormitories, since people are getting isolated and they're getting steadily moved out of the dormitories to live in areas that are not so crowded, it's not very likely to see massive new infections in dormitories. The community spread, as I have said, is under control, but we still need to watch on how the circuit breaker is working and if it is able to cut the community spread numbers into single digits. It is now in the range of 20 people every day.
I'm not singing a song only for myself now. I'm singing it for you too. And And when I said something that make you feel good inside, when I said that little thing, I said that little part that might sting you in your heart now, I want to hear you scream. I want to hear you say, ow! I want to hear you say, ow! Don't just say ow, say ow! And I believe my work will be done. Ow! Ow! I love you tomorrow, just like I love you today. I'm so weak, I don't take my heart away. Ow! But come on, come on. Gee whiz, I love you. And don't go to strangers, but come out home to me. Come out home to me. And I don't want you to go to see my next door neighbor, but I'll feel a little better if you come on to me. You don't have to tell me, but I believe somebody over here alone, someone. And I believe somebody out here alone, someone. And I believe somebody over there alone, someone. I said it's getting a little cold outside. I wonder, do you know what I'm talking about? I said it's getting a little cold outside. And everybody needs somebody. Everybody needs somebody. Everybody needs somebody. You know I like to sing this song.
Don't sing song.
I said I like to sing this song.
Don't sing song.
It make me think about the good things. It make me think about the good things. It make me think about the good things. Ow! 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 Shucks! I feel all right. I feel so good I want to scream. I want to scream.